There's a pattern in history that has destroyed three global superpowers in the last 500 years. And right now in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, decision by decision, mistake by mistake, almost like we're reading from the same script that led to catastrophe every single time before. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't political opinion. This is mathematical pattern recognition based on historical fact. And when you see it, you can't unsee it. In 1590, Spain was the richest empire on earth. They controlled half the world's gold and silver. Their military dominated Europe and the Americas. Their currency was accepted everywhere, from Manila to Madrid to Mexico City. The Spanish real was the dollar of its day. Every merchant wanted Spanish silver. Every king borrowed from Spanish banks. Every trade contract was settled in Spanish coin. Within 80 years, they were bankrupt, a second-rate power that never recovered. The gold kept flowing from the mines, but the empire collapsed anyway. How does that happen? How does a nation with unlimited wealth destroy itself? We're about to find out because they followed a pattern, a 7-stage pattern that always ends the same way. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun never set on British territory. A quarter of the world's land surface flew the Union Jack. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every central bank held British bonds. Every international contract was written in pounds. London was the financial capital of the world. British ships controlled the seas. British industry produced a third of the world's manufactured goods. British banks financed global trade. They seemed invincible. Within 40 years, the empire was gone. The currency collapsed. They became America's junior partner, forever asking Washington for permission, forever dependent on American protection, forever living in the shadow of what they used to be. How does the greatest empire in history fall that fast? Because they followed the pattern, the same 7 stages Spain had followed 300 years earlier. In 1991, the Soviet Union was the other superpower. Nuclear weapons that could destroy the world 10 times over. Global influence spanning 6 continents, satellites in space, a military that matched America's, an ideology that promised to bury capitalism. They controlled Eastern Europe. They had allies everywhere. They seemed permanent. The Cold War looked like it would last forever. It ceased to exist in 900 days, not from war, not from invasion, from economic implosion. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons, with millions of soldiers, with territory spanning 11 time zones, just stopped existing. How? Because they followed the pattern. The same 7 stages that had destroyed Spain and Britain 3 times, 3 superpowers, 3 complete collapses, all following the exact same sequence. And here's what should terrify you. The United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. We're not watching from the outside wondering if it could happen to us. It's happening right now, this very moment. Every decision our government makes is another step down the same path, and it's happening faster than the previous 3 collapses. Spain took 80 years. Britain took 40 years. The Soviet Union took 45 years from peak to collapse. How long do we have? Maybe 10 years. Maybe 5. Maybe less. This is the story of how empires die, why they always think they're different, why they always make the same mistakes, and why the math says we're next. Before we go through the pattern stage by stage, before we show you exactly where America is right now, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like, not in textbooks, not in theory, in practice, what it means when a superpower dies, what happens to the people living through it, what it feels like when your country goes from ruling the world to begging for loans. Imperial collapse doesn't start with invasion or military defeat. That's not how empires die anymore. Modern empires don't get conquered. They exhaust themselves. They extend beyond their ability to maintain themselves. Military bases in 150 countries, wars on multiple fronts, promises they cannot keep, debts they cannot repay, treaties they cannot enforce, allies they cannot defend. Every commitment requires money. Every promise requires resources. Every guarantee requires strength. And eventually, the empire runs out. At first, the decline is invisible. The currency still works. Prices rise, but slowly. The military still wins battles, smaller ones, against weaker enemies. But they win. The government still makes promises. Politicians still give speeches about American exceptionalism or British greatness or Spanish glory. The public still believes. Why wouldn't they? Nothing seems different. The supermarket shelves are full. The lights turn on. The military has a new weapon system. Everything seems fine. But beneath the surface, the foundation is cracking. Resources are misallocated. Money flows to consumption instead of production. The best minds leave for other countries or stop trying. The productive citizens who built the empire's wealth become tired of carrying everyone else. Innovation slows. Manufacturing closes. Imports replace domestic production. The country becomes dependent on others for things it used to make itself. Then comes the acceleration. This is the dangerous phase. The phase where invisible decline becomes visible crisis. Allies start hedging. They maintain the alliance officially, but behind closed doors, they're making other arrangements. Japan starts talking to China. Germany starts making deals with Russia. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil. These seem like small things. They're not. They're preparation for your collapse. Enemies test boundaries. They probe. They push. They see how you respond. Russia takes Crimea. China builds islands. Iran seizes ships. North Korea launches missiles. Each test is a question. Does the empire still have the strength to enforce its will? Can they actually back up their threats? Or are they bluffing? Trade partners seek alternatives. This is critical. When you're the reserve currency, when you're the dominant economy, everyone has to hold your currency to do business. They buy your bonds. They accept your money. They play by your rules. But when doubt creeps in, when they start wondering if your currency will hold value, they diversify. They buy gold. They create new trade agreements that bypass your currency. They develop payment systems that don't need your banks. The reserve currency status erodes, not overnight, gradually, then suddenly. And suddenly the advantages that made you powerful become vulnerabilities. Your currency, once demanded by everyone, comes flooding back home. All those dollars overseas, all those pounds that foreign banks were holding, they don't need them anymore, so they spend them. They buy your assets. They flood your markets. Inflation explodes. Your military, spread across the world, becomes unsustainable. You can't afford the bases, can't afford the deployments, can't afford the weapons. Troops come home not because the mission is complete, but because you're broke. Your promises, once guaranteed by strength, become empty words. You said you'd defend Taiwan. You can't. You said you'd protect Europe. You can't. You said you'd maintain freedom of navigation. You can't. Everyone knows it. Your allies, your enemies, your own citizens. That's not theoretical. That's not speculation. That's what happened to Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. That's what's written in the historical record. Documented, verified, undeniable. And it happened because they made exactly the same decisions we're making now. They believed their power was permanent. They told themselves they were exceptional, that the rules that applied to other empires didn't apply to them. They had special advantages, special circumstances, special destiny. They were wrong every single time. They overextended militarily. Troops everywhere, bases everywhere, wars everywhere, commitments everywhere, and the costs kept rising while the economy kept shrinking. They debased their currency. Spain mixed copper into silver. Britain printed pounds that weren't backed by gold. The Soviets printed rubles nobody wanted. We print dollars backed by nothing but the promise that we'll print more if needed. Same mistake. different mechanism. And they refused to accept reality until collapse was already underway. Every declining empire spends its final years in denial. The statistics show decay. The trends show collapse. The math shows disaster. But the politicians give speeches about greatness. The economists produce reports showing everything is fine. The media publishes articles explaining why this time is different, and the public believes them because accepting reality is too painful. Until reality forces itself on them, until the currency collapses, until the stores are empty, until the government defaults, until the empire is gone. Let's look at how it actually happened. 3 times. The exact same way, the same 7 stages, the same decisions, the same denials, the same collapse. Let's start with the first global empire, Spain, 1500s to 1600s. This is the original blueprint. This is where the pattern first appeared. Every empire since has followed this same path. After Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, Spain became the first true world power. Before this, empires were regional. Rome controlled the Mediterranean. China controlled East Asia. The Mongols controlled Central Asia. But Spain controlled territory on multiple continents simultaneously. Europe, the Americas, parts of Asia, parts of Africa. They were the first truly global empire. They conquered the Aztec Empire in 1521. Cortés with 600 men destroyed an empire of millions. They conquered the Inca Empire in 1533. Pizarro, with even fewer men, toppled another civilization. How? Superior weapons. Steel swords against bronze, muskets against spears, horses against infantry, but also disease. Smallpox killed millions of natives who had no immunity. And political timing. Both empires were dealing with internal conflicts when the Spanish arrived. But the real prize wasn't the empires themselves. It was what they contained. Gold and silver. More gold and silver than Europe had ever seen. The Spanish seized control of the richest mines ever discovered. Potosi in Bolivia, Zacatecas in Mexico, Guanajuato, Taxco. Mines that produce silver in quantities that seem impossible even today. By 1550, Spanish galleons were bringing home 200 tons of silver per year. That's 400,000 pounds every year. By 1600, over 400 tons annually. The numbers kept rising. Between 1500 and 1800, 80% of the world's silver came from Spanish America. They controlled the money supply of Europe, not just Spain, all of Europe. Every other kingdom needed Spanish silver to mint coins. Every merchant needed Spanish silver to trade. The Spanish real became the global reserve currency. It was accepted everywhere, from Amsterdam to Istanbul to Beijing. Everyone wanted Spanish silver. And this is where the pattern begins, with a country that controls the money of the world and believes that makes them invincible. King Philip II, ruling from 1556 to 1598, had more money than any monarch in history. The silver fleets arrived year after year, hundreds of tons at a time. The treasury overflowed. And Philip spent it on empire. He spent it on the largest military Europe had ever seen. He spent it on wars across 4 continents. He spent it on building palaces. He spent it on maintaining the largest bureaucracy in the world. He spent everything that came in, and then he borrowed more. Stage 1. Military overextension. Spain fought wars everywhere simultaneously, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. The Ottomans were the Islamic superpower. They controlled the Middle East, North Africa, the Balkans. Spanish and Ottoman fleets fought massive naval battles. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 involved over 400 ships and 140,000 men. Spain won, but the cost was enormous. Against France in Italy. France and Spain were fighting for control of Italian territory. Wars that lasted decades, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Constant battles, never-ending expenses against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. The Dutch wanted independence. Spain wanted to keep this rich territory. The war lasted 80 years. The Dutch fought with guerrilla tactics, flooding lands, ambushing supply lines. Spain poured men and money into a war they couldn't win against England's navy. Philip tried to invade England in 1588 with the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 men, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. The English defeated it with smaller, faster ships and lucky weather. The Armada was destroyed. But Philip built another, and another. He tried 3 times. Each time the cost was staggering. Wars in the Philippines. Spain colonized the Philippines and fought constant wars against local kingdoms and Chinese pirates. More troops, more ships, more money. Wars in the Americas. Constant fighting against native populations who resisted Spanish rule. Garrisons in every colony. Troops everywhere. Never-ending cost. By 1580, Spain had military commitments on 4 continents: Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia. They had over 100,000 soldiers deployed. That's an enormous army for the 1500s. Compare it to England, which had maybe 10,000 soldiers total. France had 30,000. Spain had more troops deployed than the rest of Europe combined. The cost was staggering. Half of Spain's revenue went to the military. Not 20%, not 30%, half. Every tax collected, half went to paying soldiers, feeding soldiers, equipping soldiers, moving soldiers, building ships to transport soldiers. And still, it wasn't enough. The wars kept expanding. The enemies kept multiplying. The costs kept rising. Stage 2, currency debasement. The Spanish crown couldn't pay its bills with taxes alone. The silver coming from America was enormous, but the expenses were more enormous. War is expensive. Empire is expensive. Philip needed more money than even the silver mines could provide. So they did what every failing empire does. They debased the currency. They started mixing copper into silver coins. This is literal currency debasement. A coin that was supposed to be pure silver, 100% silver, stamped by the crown, became 90% silver and 10% copper. The face value stayed the same. If it said 1 real, it was still worth 1 real officially. But the actual silver content had dropped. Then it became 80% silver, 20% copper, then 70-30, then 50-50. A coin that was supposed to be pure silver became half copper. The face value stayed the same, but the real value plummeted. Merchants weren't stupid. They could tell. They could weigh the coins. They could test them. They knew the coins had less silver than they were supposed to. So they stopped accepting them at face value. If the coin said 1 real but only contained half a real's worth of silver, they wanted 2 coins. Prices doubled. That's inflation. By 1600, Spanish silver coins contained barely any silver. They were copper coins with silver plating. Merchants stopped accepting them at face value. Foreign merchants refused them entirely. You could only spend debased Spanish coins in Spain because the government forced people to accept them. Outside Spain, they were worthless. Inflation exploded. Prices in Spain increased 6-fold between 1550 and 1650. Everything cost 6 times more. Bread, meat, cloth, everything. Why? Because the currency was being destroyed. This is critical to understand. Spain had all the silver in the world. They controlled the mines. They had the wealth. And they destroyed their own currency anyway because they spent more than they had. Because war costs more than any amount of silver can provide. Because debasement always fails, but governments always try it anyway. Stage 3. Debt spiral. Spain borrowed constantly from Italian bankers, from German bankers, from Dutch bankers, from anyone who would lend. The Fugger family in Germany lent millions. Italian banks in Genoa lent millions. Spain promised to repay with future silver shipments. But the silver was already spent before it arrived. The galleons would dock in Seville, unload hundreds of tons of silver, and it would be immediately shipped to foreign banks to pay debts. None of it stayed in Spain. By 1557, less than 20 years into Philip II's reign, Spain declared bankruptcy. They couldn't pay their debts. They defaulted. Told the banks, sorry, we're not paying. We'll restructure. Give us better terms. And the banks, having no choice, agreed. Spain restructured the debts and kept borrowing. 5 years later, 1560, they declared bankruptcy again. Same process. Can't pay. Need restructuring. Banks agree because what else can they do? If Spain collapses completely, the banks lose everything. Better to restructure and hope. 1575, bankruptcy again. 1596, bankruptcy again. 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. Each time they promised reforms. Each time they promised to control spending. Each time they went right back to borrowing and spending. Because the wars didn't stop, the empire didn't shrink, the commitments didn't decrease. They needed money to maintain it all, and they didn't have enough. So they borrowed until they couldn't, then defaulted, then borrowed again. This is the debt spiral. Borrowing to pay for current expenses, then borrowing to pay interest on previous loans, then borrowing to pay off old loans that are coming due. The debt grows exponentially. Interest compounds. And eventually you're borrowing just to pay interest, not even to fund new spending. That's the spiral. And once you're in it, there's no way out except collapse or default. Spain chose default 4 times, and it destroyed their credibility forever. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity. Here's what people don't understand about Spain's collapse. They had all the gold and silver in the world, and it destroyed them. This seems impossible. How does unlimited wealth destroy you? Because when you have unlimited money, you stop producing. Think about it. Why grow food when you can import it from France? Why build ships when you can buy them from Holland? Why manufacture cloth when you can buy it from England? Why innovate? Why work? Why build when you can just spend? Spanish nobility considered work beneath them, literally beneath their dignity. Manual labor was for peasants. Commerce was for Jews and foreigners. A Spanish nobleman did 3 things: fight, pray, or govern. That's it. Everything else was beneath them. Manufacturing declined. Spain had textile industries. They died. Shipbuilding died. Metalworking died. Agriculture stagnated. Spain had good farmland. They stopped farming it. Easier to import food. All the wealth flowed to importing goods from other countries. The gold and silver that came from the Americas went straight back out to pay for French wine, Italian silk, Dutch goods, English manufactured products. Spain became a conduit. Wealth flowed through them, but none of it stayed. No capital investment, no factory building, no innovation, just consumption. By 1600, Spain was producing almost nothing. They were entirely dependent on imports, entirely dependent on silver to pay for everything. And when the silver mines began to deplete, when production dropped, when expenses exceeded income, the entire system collapsed. This is the paradox of empire wealth. The wealth that makes you powerful destroys your ability to produce. Why? Because production requires work. And work seems unnecessary when you have wealth. Roman citizens stopped farming when slaves did it. British citizens stopped manufacturing when colonies did it. Soviet citizens stopped innovating when the state controlled everything. Spanish citizens stopped producing when silver bought everything. Same pattern, different mechanism, and when the wealth stops flowing, when the silver mines deplete, when the empire can't maintain itself, you're left with a population that doesn't know how to produce and an economy that can't function. Stage 5, social decay. With the economy failing, with inflation destroying savings, with imports cutting off, Spain descended into social chaos. Crime exploded. Beggars filled the streets of Madrid. Spain's capital was full of people with no work, no prospects, no future. Banditry became common in the countryside. Highways weren't safe. Travelers needed armed escorts. Corruption was everywhere. Every government official took bribes. Every contract was inflated. Every position was bought and sold. The church owned a third of Spain's land. Priests and monasteries everywhere, all consuming wealth, none producing anything. Productive citizens emigrated. The best minds left for France, England, the Netherlands. Countries that were building, creating, growing. Why stay in Spain where opportunity was dying? Spanish Jews and Muslims, the conversos and Moriscos, who had been Spain's merchant and artisan class, were expelled or fled. The people who knew how to build businesses, how to trade, how to create wealth, they left. Spain was left with bureaucrats, soldiers, and priests, no one creating wealth. Everyone consuming it. The social fabric tore apart, trust disappeared, communities fractured. The sense that Spain was a great nation faded. People knew the empire was dying, they just didn't know how to stop it. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal. Portugal had been joined with Spain since 1580. They rebelled and broke free. Spain couldn't stop them. By 1650, they lost the Netherlands, their richest territory. The Dutch won independence after 80 years of war. Spain couldn't hold them. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was a shell, still large on paper, still claiming territory in the Americas, but economically dead, militarily exhausted, politically irrelevant. They went from the world superpower to a secondary power in less than a century, and they never recovered. Spain today is a pleasant country, nice climate, good food, rich history. But they're irrelevant on the world stage. They're not in the G7. They're not a military power. They don't set global policy. The descendants of the conquistadors are a tourist destination. That's what imperial collapse looks like. A superpower becomes a museum. Let's jump forward 300 years to the British Empire. 1900 to 1950. This is the most important example for Americans because Britain's collapse is the closest parallel to what's happening to us right now. Britain at its peak was the greatest empire in human history. Not the largest by land. The Mongols controlled more territory. Not the most populous. China had more people. But the most powerful, the most advanced, the most dominant empire ever created. At its peak in 1920, Britain controlled 25% of the world's land surface. That's 1/4 of all land on Earth. 13 million square miles, 400 million subjects. More people lived under British rule than any empire in history. The empire included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, parts of China, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, Sudan, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, various Caribbean islands, and more. Everywhere you looked, the Union Jack was flying. The British Navy was larger than the next two navies combined. Over 400 capital ships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers. They controlled the seas absolutely. No other nation could challenge them. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every central bank held British bonds. Every major trade contract was denominated in pounds. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed pounds. If you wanted to buy wheat, you needed pounds. International trade ran on pounds. London was the financial center of the world. More capital flowed through London than all other financial centers combined. New York was growing, but London dominated. British banks financed global trade. British insurance companies insured global shipping. British merchants connected global markets. The City of London was the heart of the global economy. British industry produced a third of the world's manufactured goods: steel, ships, textiles, locomotives, machinery. The phrase, "made in Britain," meant quality. It meant reliability. The Industrial Revolution had started in Britain, and they still led the world. British technology was the most advanced. British engineers built railroads on 6 continents. British ships carried half the world's trade. British telegraph cables connected the world. They seemed invincible. In 1897, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrated 60 years of her reign. The celebrations lasted weeks. Representatives from every part of the empire came to London. The message was clear. Britain is eternal. The empire will last forever. British power is permanent. They believed it. Everyone believed it. How could an empire this large, this powerful, this advanced ever fall? The same way Spain fell, the same way every empire falls. By following the pattern. Stage 1. Military overextension. By 1900, Britain had military commitments everywhere. They had to defend territory on 6 continents. India alone required 70,000 British troops. That's just India. Africa required garrisons in dozens of colonies. The Middle East required troops after World War I, when Britain took control of Palestine, Iraq, Jordan. China required troops to protect British interests during the chaos of Chinese civil wars. The Pacific required naval bases in Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia. The Caribbean required garrisons. Even tiny islands needed protection. Britain had over 100 military bases worldwide. They had naval squadrons in every ocean. They had armies in India, Africa, the Middle East. They had commitments to defend allies in Europe. The cost was enormous. And when World War I started in 1914, Britain faced a choice. This is the critical decision. The decision that set Britain on the path to collapse. They could stay neutral. The war was starting between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. It didn't involve Britain directly. They had no treaty obligation to fight. They could let Europe destroy itself while Britain maintained its empire and its wealth. Or they could jump in, honor their alliance with France, fight Germany, win the war, but bankrupt the empire in the process. They chose to fight. At the time, it seemed like the right choice, the noble choice, the honorable choice. Britain had always been involved in European affairs. They had always balanced power on the continent. They couldn't let Germany dominate. But the cost was staggering. World War I lasted 4 years, 1914 to 1918. Britain mobilized 8.7 million men, nearly 9 million men in uniform. They fought on the Western Front in France. They fought in the Middle East against the Ottomans. They fought in Africa against German colonies. They fought at sea against German submarines. The casualties were horrific. 900,000 British soldiers died, almost 1 million dead, another 2 million wounded. An entire generation of young men was destroyed. But the financial cost was worse. World War I cost Britain over $40 billion. In 1918 dollars, that's over $1 trillion in today's money. How did they pay for it? They borrowed. Mostly from the United States. Britain had been the world's creditor. Every other nation borrowed from Britain. After World War I, Britain owed America billions. The creditor had become the debtor. This was a fundamental shift. Britain had always lent money. Now they borrowed it. They had always been owed. Now they owed. The relationship between Britain and America flipped. America was now the senior partner. But Britain had won the war. They had defeated Germany. They had kept the empire. They thought they could rebuild. They were wrong. Stage 2. Currency debasement. The pound sterling was supposed to be backed by gold. That was the foundation of the global financial system, the gold standard. Every pound could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. This made the pound trustworthy, stable, reliable. But the war had drained Britain's gold reserves. They had shipped gold to America to pay for weapons, food, supplies. American factories produced the shells, the rifles, the uniforms. American farms fed British soldiers. American banks lent the money. All of it had to be paid for with gold. By 1920, Britain's gold reserves were half what they had been in 1914. Half. They had shipped hundreds of tons of gold across the Atlantic. But they tried to maintain the pound's value anyway. In 1925, Britain went back on the gold standard at the pre-war rate. 1 pound equals $4.86, same rate as 19 or 14. The problem? The pound was overvalued. Britain's economy had been damaged by the war. Production was down. Debt was up. They didn't have enough gold to back the currency at that rate, but they tried anyway. Why? Pride, prestige, the belief that Britain had to maintain the pound's value to maintain the empire. The result was disaster. British exports became too expensive. A British factory makes steel. Before the war, they could sell it globally. After the war, with the pound overvalued, British steel was too expensive. Foreign buyers went elsewhere. Manufacturing declined. British factories closed. Jobs disappeared. Unemployment rose. By 1930, unemployment was over 20%. 1 in 5 workers had no job. And the government had to keep interest rates high to defend the currency. High interest rates meant expensive loans. Businesses couldn't borrow to invest. Construction stopped. Growth stopped. The entire economy stagnated. This destroyed the domestic economy. Britain was sacrificing its people to maintain the pound's value, and by 1931 they couldn't hold it anymore. In September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound lost 25% of its value overnight. 25%. If you had 100 pounds, it was now worth 75 pounds. Savings were destroyed. The global reserve currency had just admitted it couldn't keep its promises. This was the beginning of the end. When the reserve currency breaks its promise, when it admits it can't maintain value, trust disappears. And once trust is gone, it never comes back. Stage 3. Debt spiral. Britain never recovered from World War I debt. They owed billions to America. They were making payments, but barely. Interest was piling up. They were borrowing to make payments on previous borrowing. That's the spiral. And then World War II started. September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. Britain declared war on Germany again. 20 years after the First War, they were fighting Germany again. And this time, it was worse. World War II cost Britain $120 billion. In 1945 dollars, that's over $2 trillion in today's money. More than World War I. Much more. How did they pay? More borrowing from America. The Lend-Lease program. America sent Britain ships, planes, tanks, food, fuel, everything, billions of dollars worth of equipment, on credit. Pay us back after the war. Britain had no choice. They needed American supplies to survive. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada over $30 billion, more than Britain's entire GDP. Imagine owing more than your entire economic output. Every pound generated in a year, you owe more than that. That's how bad it was. The war was won, Hitler was defeated, but the empire was finished. They couldn't defend it anymore, couldn't afford it, couldn't maintain it. The costs of keeping the empire exceeded any benefit it provided. India, the crown jewel, cost more to administer than it generated in revenue. Africa was a net drain. The Middle East required constant military presence. The empire had become a burden, but Britain wasn't ready to admit it. Stage 4. Loss of empire. This is where Britain's collapse becomes visible. Before this, the decline was economic, hidden. Statistics and government reports. After this, the collapse was obvious to everyone. In 1947, Britain gave up India, not by choice. They couldn't hold it. Indian independence movements had been growing for decades. Gandhi, Nehru, millions of Indians demanding freedom. Britain had promised independence after World War II. They kept the promise because they had no choice. The cost of holding India by force was impossible. India was partitioned into India and Pakistan. Millions died in the religious violence that followed. But Britain was gone. The crown jewel, the source of wealth for 200 years, gone. Over the next 20 years, Britain lost everything. 1948, Palestine was given up. Britain had controlled it since World War I. The Mandate ended. Israel was created. Britain left. 1956, the Suez Crisis. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France tried to take it back militarily. America told them to stop. Britain obeyed. The message was clear. Britain couldn't act independently anymore. America was in charge. 1960s, Africa became independent. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ghana. One by one, they gained independence. Britain couldn't hold them. The cost was too high. The military was too small. The will was gone. 1970s, the Caribbean colonies became independent. The Pacific colonies became independent. Hong Kong remained until 1997, but only because China allowed it. By 1970, the British Empire existed only in history books. The empire that controlled a quarter of the earth was reduced to Britain itself and a few tiny islands. The Union Jack was lowered in hundreds of cities. God Save the Queen was played for the last time in dozens of colonies. The empire was gone, and it never came back. Stage 5, currency collapse. The pound kept falling. This is the visible economic collapse, the loss of reserve currency status. In 1940, 1 pound equaled $4.03. That was the official rate. By 1950, it was $2.80. By 1970, it was $2.40. By 1980, it was $2.30. By 1990, it was $1.90. Today, it's $1.27. The pound has lost 70% of its value against the dollar since 1940. But that understates it because the dollar itself has been falling. Against gold, against real goods, the pound has lost over 98% of its value since 1914. The global reserve currency became a regional currency. Central banks that used to hold pounds sold them. Trade that used to be denominated in pounds switched to dollars. The city of London remained a financial center, but New York was bigger. London's role changed from leader to follower. Britain tried to maintain pretense. They kept their permanent seat on the UN Security Council, one of 5 nations with veto power. They maintained nuclear weapons, very expensive nuclear weapons they could barely afford. They maintained the special relationship with America. The idea that Britain and America were partners, equals, friends. But everyone knew the truth. It wasn't a partnership. It was dependence. Britain followed American foreign policy. Britain supported American wars. Britain asked American permission. They were a former power, a junior partner, a satellite. The empire was gone, and it never came back. Today, Britain is a middle power. They have the 6th largest economy. They have a competent military, but small. They have cultural influence through language and history, but they don't set global policy. They don't control global finance. They don't lead. They follow, from the greatest empire in history to a regional power in 40 years. That's how fast it happened. And most British people alive today remember when the empire still existed. They remember when Britain mattered. They're living through the aftermath. This is important for Americans to understand because Britain's collapse is our future. The parallels are exact. Reserve currency, global military, massive debt, declining production, social decay. Britain went through all 7 stages and collapsed. We're at stage 5. Let's look at the most recent example, the Soviet Union, 1945 to 1991. After World War II, the USSR emerged as a superpower. They had defeated Nazi Germany. Their army was the largest in the world. They controlled Eastern Europe. They had nuclear weapons. They had an ideology that promised to bury capitalism. Communism would win. The Soviet model would dominate. History was on their side. Dialectical materialism proved it. For 45 years, they competed with America. The Cold War. 2 superpowers. 2 systems. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus central planning. The battle for the future of humanity. The Soviets matched American military power. They built more tanks, more artillery, more soldiers. They matched America in nuclear weapons. They achieved nuclear parity by the 1960s, mutually assured destruction. Both sides could destroy the world. They matched America in space. Sputnik, first satellite. First man in space, Yuri Gagarin. First woman in space, first spacewalk. The Soviets led the space race for years. They supported allies globally: Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Syria, Egypt, Angola, Ethiopia. Everywhere America had influence, the Soviets countered. They seemed like they would last forever, but beneath the surface, the economy was dying. The Soviet economy was never efficient, but in the early years, it grew anyway. Industrialization, electrification, building dams, factories, cities. Central planning worked for simple goals: build more steel, produce more tractors. The state commanded, and it happened. But as the economy became more complex, central planning failed. You can't centrally plan an entire modern economy. There are too many products, too many variables, too many decisions. Markets work because they process information that no central planner can process. Prices signal scarcity. Profits signal demand. Losses signal waste. In a market, these signals guide production automatically. In central planning, bureaucrats guess. By the 1970s, Soviet growth stopped. The statistics said growth continued, but the statistics were lies. Everyone knew it. Soviet factories produced quotas, not quality. A factory told to produce 10,000 shoes produces 10,000 shoes. They might be left shoes. They might fall apart. Doesn't matter. The quota is met. Soviet farms produced food, but much of it rotted before reaching consumers. Distribution was broken. Storage was inadequate. Incentives were wrong. Soviet technology fell behind. They could copy American technology, but they couldn't innovate. Innovation requires freedom. Freedom to fail, freedom to experiment, freedom to challenge authority. The Soviet system crushed all of that. Stage 1. Military overextension. The Soviet Union spent 15 to 20% of GDP on the military. That's triple what America spent. They had to match American technology, American reach, American alliances. But their economy was a fraction of the size. America's GDP was 3 times larger. Spending 20% of a small economy on military meant devastating cuts to civilian needs. Soviet citizens had no consumer goods, no cars, no appliances, no variety in food. Everything went to the military. They were in Afghanistan, a war that lasted 9 years, 1979 to 1988. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers fighting Afghan guerrillas. Billions of rubles spent, nothing gained. They were propping up Cuba. Fidel Castro's communist regime survived only because of Soviet subsidies. Billions of dollars worth of oil, food, equipment sent to Cuba for free. They were supporting Syria, Vietnam, North Korea, Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. Everywhere America had influence, they had to counter. The cost was unsustainable. Stage 2. Economic stagnation. The Soviet economy stopped growing in the 1970s. Oil revenue kept them afloat. The Soviets were major oil producers. When oil prices rose in the 1970s, they had cash. But nothing else worked. Factories produced junk. Farms failed. Technology fell decades behind. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain. A country with some of the best farmland on earth couldn't feed itself. Why? Because central planning doesn't work. Because collectivized farms are inefficient. Because farmers who don't own their land don't care about production. The Soviet Union imported grain from America, from Canada, from Argentina. This is humiliating. A superpower that can't feed its own people. The Soviet consumer economy was a joke. Stores were empty. Citizens waited in line for hours to buy basic goods: bread, milk, meat. Everything was scarce. Everything required connections. If you wanted a car, you waited years. If you wanted an apartment, you waited years. Quality was terrible. Soviet cars broke down constantly. Soviet appliances didn't work. Soviet construction was shoddy. This was the reality behind the propaganda. The propaganda said the Soviet Union was strong, growing, inevitable. The reality was decay, scarcity, dysfunction. Stage 3. Currency collapse. The ruble was never a real currency. It couldn't be exchanged internationally. It wasn't convertible. No foreign bank wanted rubles. No foreign merchant accepted rubles. Even Soviet citizens didn't trust it. They used dollars when they could get them. The black market ran on dollars. Tourists were mobbed by people wanting to trade rubles for dollars at any rate. The official exchange rate was meaningless. The government said 1 ruble equals $1. The black market said 20 rubles equals $1. The government had to buy foreign goods with gold and oil because nobody wanted rubles. They sold oil for dollars. They sold gold for dollars. Then they used the dollars to buy wheat, technology, consumer goods. By 1985, oil prices dropped. Soviet oil revenue fell by half. They were running out of hard currency. Gold reserves were depleting. They were running out of real money. Stage 4. Loss of empire. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. This is the most dramatic moment of Soviet collapse. November 9, 1989. East German citizens started crossing into West Berlin. The guards didn't stop them. The government didn't stop them. The wall that had divided Berlin since 1961 became meaningless. Within weeks, it was torn down. The symbol of Soviet control destroyed. Eastern Europe left. Poland held elections. Solidarity, the anti-communist union, won. The communists were voted out. Hungary opened its borders. Citizens could leave. They left by the thousands. Czechoslovakia had the Velvet Revolution, peaceful protests. The communist government resigned. Romania's dictator Ceausescu was executed. East Germany collapsed. The country reunified with West Germany in 1990. All of this happened in 1 year. The satellites that gave the Soviet Union strategic depth vanished. The buffer zone that protected Russia from Western Europe disappeared. The empire that had taken 45 years to build fell apart in 12 months. The Soviet government couldn't stop it. They were broke. They couldn't pay to maintain control. They couldn't afford to invade. They couldn't even afford to keep the lights on in their own country. Stage 5. Complete collapse. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, 900 days from the Berlin Wall falling to complete dissolution. Not 900 years, 900 days. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, had tried reforms, glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. He thought he could save the system by reforming it. He was wrong. You can't reform a system built on lies. You can't fix an economy built on central planning. You can't save an empire that's bankrupt. The harder he tried to reform, the faster it collapsed. The Soviet Union broke apart into 15 separate countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Central Asian republics, the Caucasus states. Each became independent. The superpower became 15 separate nations. The military couldn't be paid. Soldiers weren't receiving salaries. Officers were selling equipment to buy food. Nuclear weapons sat unguarded. The government couldn't function. Services stopped. Pensions weren't paid. Salaries weren't paid. The entire state apparatus ran out of money. The ruble became worthless. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. People who had saved for decades saw their life savings become worthless in weeks. A lifetime of work vanished. The economy collapsed. GDP fell by 50% between 1991 and 1998. 50%. Half the economy disappeared. Imagine half of all economic activity stopping. Factories closed. Jobs disappeared. People starved. This was a nuclear superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons, and it collapsed from internal economic failure. No war, no invasion, just implosion. The pattern played out again. Military overextension, economic stagnation, currency failure, loss of empire, complete collapse. Exactly like Spain, exactly like Britain. The same 7 stages, the same mistakes, the same result. And here's what should keep you awake at night. The United States is following the exact same pattern. Stage by stage. Let me show you exactly where we are. Stage 1. Military overextension. The United States has over 750 military bases in 80 countries. Not 80 bases. 750 bases in 80 different countries. We have troops in 150 countries. American soldiers are deployed on every continent except Antarctica. We're committed to defending Europe through NATO. 30 countries. We're committed to defending Japan through our Mutual Defense Treaty. We're committed to defending South Korea. We're committed to defending the Philippines. We're committed to defending Australia. We have defense agreements with dozens of countries. We're fighting in the Middle East. Still, troops in Iraq, troops in Syria, troops in Afghanistan technically left, but special forces remain. We're countering China, naval patrols in the South China Sea, arms sales to Taiwan, defense commitments to Pacific allies. We're countering Russia, troops in Poland, troops in the Baltic states, support for Ukraine. Our military budget is $850 billion annually. That's official spending. Add in veterans benefits, intelligence agencies, nuclear weapons maintenance, and the real number is over $1 trillion. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined. China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Italy. Add them all up. We spend more, and it's not enough. We're stretched thin. Equipment is aging. Aircraft carriers that should be replaced are being extended. Fighter jets from the 1980s are still flying. Tanks from the 1990s are still in service. We can't afford to replace everything that needs replacing. Recruitment is down. The military is having trouble finding recruits. Young Americans don't want to join. The standards are being lowered to meet quotas. And we have commitments we can't fulfill. If China invades Taiwan, we've implied we'll defend them. Can we? While maintaining commitments in Europe, the Middle East, Korea, Japan. If Russia pushes into NATO territory, we're obligated to respond. Can we? While dealing with China and maintaining forces globally, if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, we'd have to reopen it. Can we? While dealing with Russia and China? We can't respond to all of it simultaneously. We're overextended, exactly like Spain, with troops on 4 continents, exactly like Britain defending an empire they couldn't afford, exactly like the USSR trying to match America globally. We're making the same mistake. Check. Stage 1 complete. Stage 2. Currency debasement. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. Foreign countries could no longer exchange dollars for gold. The dollar became pure fiat currency, money backed by nothing except the government's promise. Since then, the money supply has exploded. In 2000, M2 money supply was $4.6 trillion. By 2020, it was $15.5 trillion, a 300% increase. Since 2020, we've added another $6 trillion. M2 is now over $21 trillion. That's a 400% increase since 2000. We've printed 400% more dollars in 25 years. The Federal Reserve creates money by buying bonds. The government issues bonds. The Fed buys them with newly created money. This is literally money printing. It's electronic, not physical printing presses, but the effect is the same. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods. That's inflation. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. What cost $1 in 1971 costs $50 today. Your savings lose value every year. Your wages buy less every year. We're not mixing copper into silver coins like Spain. We're just printing unlimited paper. The mechanism is different. The result is the same. Currency debasement, inflation, theft from savers. Check. Stage 2 complete. Stage 3. Debt spiral. The United States owes $36 trillion. Read that again. $36 trillion. That's the official national debt. It's probably higher because some obligations are off the books. $36 trillion is 120% of GDP. We owe more than the entire economy produces in a year. Interest payments alone are approaching $1 trillion per year. Just the interest. Not paying down the debt, just interest. We're spending more on interest than on defense. More on interest than on all non-defense discretionary spending combined. We run deficits every year. $1.8 trillion deficit in 2024 in a growing economy. During peacetime, we're not at war, not in recession, and we still ran a $1.8 trillion deficit. The debt grows every year. It never shrinks. Every year, we add another trillion or two. We borrow to pay interest on previous borrowing. That's the definition of a debt spiral. Spain defaulted 4 times in 40 years. We haven't defaulted yet. But we're on the same path. Borrowing, accelerating. Interest compounding. No plan to stop, no political will to cut spending, no ability to raise taxes enough to cover spending. The math doesn't work. At some point, the debt becomes unpayable. We're approaching that point. Check. Stage 3 complete. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity. America doesn't make things anymore. We design, we finance, we consume, but we don't produce. Our manufacturing base has been gutted, shipped to China, Mexico, Vietnam, anywhere labor is cheaper. Steel production? China makes 10 times more than America. Shipbuilding? China builds 40% of global ships. America builds less than 1%. Electronics? Almost entirely made in Asia. Pharmaceuticals? 80% of active ingredients come from China and India. Rare earth elements? 80% from China. We're dependent on foreign supply chains for everything. Medicine, electronics, steel, aluminum, even military components. Just like Spain became dependent on imports while the silver flowed out, we're dependent on imports while dollars flow out. We import $800 billion more than we export annually every year. $800 billion. That's dollars leaving America, going overseas, not coming back. We used to manufacture. We don't anymore. We used to build ships. We don't anymore. We used to produce steel. We don't anymore. We innovate, we design, we create intellectual property, but we don't make physical things. And when global supply chains break down, when China stops shipping, when we can't get components, we're helpless. Check. Stage 4 complete. Stage 5. Social decay. This is where America is right now. Deep into Stage 5, the signs are everywhere. Trust in institutions is at all-time lows. Congress has single-digit approval ratings. The media is distrusted by 70% of Americans. Elections are called fraudulent by both sides. Nobody trusts anything anymore. Crime is rising, not just in statistics, in perception. People feel unsafe. Carjackings, smash and grab robberies, stores closing because of theft. Homelessness is exploding. Every major city has tent encampments. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, New York. People living on streets, in tents, in parks. Drug overdoses kill 100,000 Americans annually. Fentanyl, heroin, meth. An entire generation is being destroyed. Life expectancy is falling. For the first time in American history outside of war or pandemic, life expectancy is declining. The best and brightest are leaving or checking out. High earners are moving to low-tax states or foreign countries. Talented people are retiring early. Top students are avoiding public service. Nobody wants to work in government. Nobody trusts the system. Fertility rates are collapsing. American women are having 1.6 children on average. That's below replacement rate. The population is aging. Fewer workers supporting more retirees. Political dysfunction is total. Congress can't pass budgets. They pass continuing resolutions, kicking the can down the road. They can't agree on anything, can't fix anything, can't build anything. Infrastructure crumbles. Roads, bridges, airports, all deteriorating. The signs of decay are everywhere, but everyone pretends it's fine. Politicians give speeches about American greatness. The media publishes articles about why we're still number one. Economists explain why the economy is strong. It's not strong. It's decaying. Check. Stage 5, complete. We're on stage 5 of 7. That's where America is right now. We've completed the first 5 stages. The Soviet Union made it to stage 5 before complete collapse. Britain made it through all 7 stages, but took 40 years. Spain took longer, but followed the same path. We're not at the end yet. But we're deep into the sequence, and it's accelerating. Stage 6 is loss of reserve currency status. That's when allies start diversifying, when trade moves to other currencies, when the dollar comes flooding back home because no one needs to hold it anymore. We're seeing early signs. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are developing alternatives. They're creating a new currency. They're building payment systems that bypass the dollar. They're trading in local currencies. Central banks are buying gold. Central banks globally have bought more gold in the last 3 years than any time since 1950. Why? Because they're preparing for dollar decline. China and Russia trade in yuan and rubles. They don't use dollars anymore. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil. This is huge. Oil has been priced in dollars for 50 years. The petrodollar system. Saudis sell oil for dollars. This forced everyone to hold dollars. Now they're accepting yuan. The cracks are forming. More countries are joining BRICS. Over 40 countries have expressed interest. They're building an alternative system, a system that doesn't depend on American banks, American currency, American control. When this reaches critical mass, when enough trade bypasses the dollar, stage 6 is complete. And when stage 6 completes, stage 7 follows quickly. Stage 7 is collapse, not gradual decline, sudden implosion. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existent in 900 days. Britain lost the empire in 20 years. Spain took longer, but never recovered. The result is the same. When the reserve currency fails, when the debt becomes impossible, when the military can't be funded, it doesn't decline gracefully. It collapses quickly, brutally. One day, everything seems fine. The dollar still works. The government still functions. The military is still deployed. Then something breaks. Maybe it's a debt crisis. The government can't roll over debt. Interest rates spike. Or maybe it's a currency crisis. Foreign holders of dollars sell. The dollar plunges. Inflation explodes. Or maybe it's a political crisis. A government shutdown that doesn't end. A constitutional crisis. A breakdown of legitimacy. Whatever the trigger, the collapse accelerates. Allies panic. They dump dollar assets. They withdraw from treaties. They make separate deals with China, with Russia, with anyone who isn't collapsing. The currency falls. Imports become expensive. Stores empty. People panic. The government prints more money to pay bills. Hyperinflation begins. The military comes home. Not because the mission is complete, because we're broke. Bases close. Treaties end. The empire evaporates. And everyone who thought it couldn't happen here learns the same lesson every empire learns. It can, and it does. 3 empires followed this pattern: Spain, Britain, the USSR. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed they were different. Each believed the rules didn't apply to them. Each had reasons why their situation was unique. Spain had the silver mines, unlimited wealth. How could they fall? Britain had the empire, a quarter of the earth. How could they fall? The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, military parity with America. How could they fall? They all fell. Because the pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot spend beyond your means forever. Eventually, the debt compounds until it can't be paid. You cannot maintain empire without productive capacity. Eventually, imports exceed your ability to pay for them. You cannot debase your currency without consequences. Eventually, people lose faith and the currency collapses. You cannot avoid stage 6 and 7 once you've completed 1 through 5. The sequence is locked in. The stages progress. The outcome is determined. The only question is timing. Maybe we have 10 years, maybe 5, maybe less. The acceleration since 2020 suggests less. We've printed more money in 5 years than the previous 30. We've added more debt in 5 years than the previous 20. We've hollowed out more production. We've increased more commitments. We've fractured society more. Every stage is accelerating. The pattern says collapse is coming. And when it comes, it won't be slow. It'll be sudden. A currency crisis that triggers a debt crisis that triggers a political crisis. Overnight, the superpower becomes a cautionary tale. The reserve currency becomes a regional currency. The empire becomes a memory. 3 times it happened before. Spain in the 1600s, Britain in the 1940s, the USSR in 1991. The pattern says we're next. We're following the same path, making the same mistakes, believing the same lies. We're different. We have technology, we have the dollar, we're America. But Spain had silver, Britain had the empire, the USSR had nuclear weapons. It didn't save them, it won't save us. Since 2020, we've sprinted through the stages. Stage 1, overextension. We've added commitments, Ukraine, Taiwan. More NATO expansion. Stage 2, debasement. We've printed $6 trillion, more than any time in history outside of war. Stage 3, debt spiral. We've added $10 trillion to the debt in 5 years. Stage 4, production loss. We've seen more manufacturing leave, more dependence on China. Stage 5, social decay. Trust has collapsed further. Division has increased. Dysfunction has worsened. We're not walking the path anymore. We're sprinting down it. And the end is visible if you know the pattern. Maybe we'll find a way out. Maybe America can do what Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union couldn't. Maybe we'll reform before it's too late. Cut spending. Restore production. Rebuild trust. Strengthen the currency. Reduce commitments. Maybe this time really is different. Maybe we'll be the first empire to see the pattern and change course. Maybe we'll defy history. But the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. History, which has watched empires die the same way over and over, says we're about to learn the lesson the hard way. The pattern is clear. We're at stage 5. Stage 6 is forming. The loss of reserve currency status is beginning. And stage 7, collapse, follows quickly after. When? Nobody knows exactly. But the pattern suggests soon. Very soon. If you're watching this in 2025, you're watching the beginning of stage 6. You're watching the early signs of American imperial collapse. The same signs that appeared before Spain fell, before Britain fell, before the Soviet Union fell. Future historians will look back at this period and see it clearly. The warning signs were obvious. The pattern was visible, but nobody acted. Nobody changed course. Everyone believed it couldn't happen to them, and it happened anyway, because it always does. That's the lesson of the 7-stage collapse pattern. Empires die, always. They follow a pattern, always. They believe they're different, always. They're wrong, always. Spain learned, Britain learned, the Soviet Union learned. Now it's our turn. The question isn't if. The pattern shows the if. The question is when. And the answer is soon.